Hi everyone, my name is Jean-Christophe. In this beginner Python tutorial, we will learn about Python loops. There are two types of loops in Python, the for loop and the while loop. Those loops are control flow statements that you can use to repeat a block of code again and again and again and again. The while loop will loop recursively as long as the condition is true, so it can loop infinitely. The for loop allows you to give you a sequence on which to iterate over. So let's look at the first type of loop. So the while loop executes until the condition becomes false. So it will loop forever as long as the condition is true. So we could say I equal 10 or I equal 0, and we could say while I is less than 5, print I. And at each iteration, we could say I plus equal 1. So we would add 1 to I element. So we can see that it looped until the condition was met and then stopped. One thing to be aware of is that a while loop runs as long as the condition is true. So if you say while true and you said print hello, for example, and then you run this, it will run forever as long as the code is not stopped. So here I'm interrupting it, but it would have printed for as long as the condition is true, and in this case, that was forever. So in order to prevent that, we could say use the break statement. So we could say while true, print hello. And in this case, if we use the break statement, it will loop only once because we decided to break it after the first iteration. So it printed it only once. One last concept I want to introduce with the while loop is the else statement. So the while loop operates a bit like the if-else statement, and you can also do it. So let's take our previous loop that we have seen, and what we want to know is whenever it breaks, we want to print a statement that says I is greater than 5. So if we do this, we can then return something. So it did the entire loop, and when it broke, it returned the print statement. Next, we have the for loop. So in this case, the for loop is iterating through a sequence. So while the while loop was always running as long as the condition is true, the for loop can allow you to give gates on which it should loops on. So for example, we could say for I in, and we could a sequence, which is a list this case, and we can say print I. Running this, we can see that it went through each element of the sequence and it printed it. You can loop other types. For example, you can loop a string. So we could say for letter in hello, then we could say print letter. So you don't have to loop through a list. You can loop through any type of sequence in Python. Again, we can use the break statement in the for loop. So for example, if we take again this loop that we had, we could say if letter equals E, then we could say break the loop. So as print each element when the letter equals E, then you break it. So it's the break statement stopped the loop early, and we ended up with the statement. So we have just seen how the break statement stop the loop early. The continue is also another control flow statement that can be used in order to skip to the next iteration in the loop. So for example, what we could say is we could say for letter in Python, and we can say, okay, if the letter equal H, then we could say continue. So in this case, the loop doesn't stop. We say print letter. It doesn't break, it just skipped to the next iteration. So when we look here, it printed each letter apart from the H. So we already saw that the for loop just iterates through a sequence of elements. So in this case, the range function returns a sequence of elements. So you could say for I in range 5, and we could say print I. So then what we'll do is you will print each element from 0 to 5 using the range function. You can also use the range parameters in order to increment. So you could say for x in range, and then we could say print x. So here what will happen is we will start with the 2, and then we will end at 20, and we will increment by 2. So if we use that for loop, we'll see that, okay, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, blah, 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 until we reach 20. So we can also nest loop within loop. So you can also create a loop inside of another other loop. And the only way, the simple way to do this is you do the for I in, and you could say ABC. And then by convention, what you'll do is you'll move to the next letter. So if you're inside it, you would say for J in DEF, and then you could print IJ. So what will happen here is it will loop through each A's, and then for each A will loop through the DEF, and then it will move to the B's, DEF, and the C's, DEF. So this looping, nested looping technique is very useful in Python to do things such as looping through a nested list. So if you want to print each of these elements, for example, you could use the nested for loop by saying for I in, or for nesting in list, and then you could say for I in nest, and then you could print I. So what will happen here is you'll print each of the nested element, because without that you would have just did a simple loop and have done for list and nest, and you would have printed the entire list. If you want to loop through dictionaries now, there are many ways you can do it, but you can use the dictionaries method to do so. So if we have that dictionary, if we print that my dict, if we return that to the console, we see that we have a dictionary, and we can use the my dict keys method in order to just get the keys. So we can see that this method will return a list of the keys from the dictionaries, or you could use the my dict values. Let's just look at the methods for now, but this method would return the values instead of the keys. Or alternatively, you can use the items method to return the output as a tuple. So in this case, you're creating a list of tuples for which we can loop. So if you look at this pattern, you'll see that it's similar to looping through nested items. So let's look at how we can print keys, for example. Using the for loop, we can print all the keys of the dictionaries by looking at for x in my dict and keys. We've seen that the keys method return all the keys from the dictionary. So then if we print x, we'll see that we're printing each key. We can also print the values from it using the keys method. So you could say, okay, my dict x, because in this case, what we're doing is we're selecting the key from the dictionary. So here we're printing the values from the dictionaries. So far, I hope this is not too confusing. If you've never done, essentially what this is if I'm taking my dictionary and I'm selecting name from it, I'll have the value, right? So in this case, it's exactly what it does, but it's just looping through each value. The alternative way to do this is to use the values method on the dictionary. So you could say for x in my dict values. Then instead of having to select it, we're just printing x this time, and we're again returning all the values. So if you want to print keys of values, then it would be very complex to say, okay, for key in my dict keys, and then you would say, okay, for, so print key, and then you would say my dict key. So then you would, in this way, what you'll do is you would print the key values, right? A better way to do this would be to use the items method just as what we've seen. And what we would do is instead of saying for key here, we would say for key value, and then it would iterate through each of them similarly, but in a much simpler way. In Python, there is a concept of iterators. An iterator in Python is an object that it can be iterated upon. So by definition, we can use a for loop to iterate through an iterator. So one of the example of this is an enumerate function returns an object that can be iterated upon. So if we just return the object here, what we'll return is an object for which we can loop. And if we want to get the first element, we could use the next function, for example, to go this. A better way to loop through that iterator, however, is to use the for loop. So for example, we could say we can use the enumerate list here, and we could say for index letter in enumerate list, we could say print f index and return the index here and say letter. So this is a good way to just show what is the index of your element. Otherwise, what you would have needed to do would have been to say, okay, so we could have instantiate I equals 0 for letter in list, print I letter, and then we would have done I plus equal 1. So that would have been a second way to do the same thing as what we just did. So the enumerate iterator is very useful for you to do this kind of logic. Next, we will loop through pandas data frame. So if you've never seen what a pandas data frame is essentially what's built on NumPy, and it uses arrays to create table-like structure. So for example, if I run this pandas data frame here, what I have is a pandas with the column I gave it, the index I gave it, and the values associated with each element. So if we want to loop through each element in the pandas data frame, for example, what we'll need is to use a for loop again. So we can say for column in data frame, and then we can print the column. So that's how you loop through each of the columns to print them off. Otherwise, you can use the iteros method. So if you do df iteros, you will end up with a generator object, and from that generator object you can use the next method and say, okay, let's run this and we return the iterator object, and then what we'll do is we'll get the first row with each of the column using the df itero. We can start integrating this with the for loop. So we could say for index row in the df rows. And what we could do is say, okay, let's print the index first and run this. So what we'll see is we're printing each of the index here. We can also print each row. So we can take this iterator object and we can start splitting it into each of the element, and then we can decide to print the type of the row. For example, if we run this again, so what we'll see is that we are running the index here, we're running the row, so we're printing each column, and for example, for each of the column we could say, okay, just select one element, so column 1, here double quotes like this, and here you can say that wrote So we can see here, I've selected the element from column 1 here this way. So there are many ways. So you can select each index from the data frame. You can select an entire row. You can select one element from a row using the row and column, and you can also show, for example, the type, which is a pandas series here. So let's do that again just for simple more clarity. So we can say for index row in df either rows, and then we can say print the index. And I just want to loop through one of the columns this time, and I just want to print the row for the column 1, and then we print this, and we can see that it looped through each of the element, but just for one column this time. Cool. So now we have learned while loop, for loops. We've learned how to use generator objects to loop. We've learned how to loop through pandas data frame. Let's dive into slightly more complex concepts. And one of these is, how do you break multiple loops? Because if I take this loop here, I will range through the value from 0 to 9, and then I will range a loop from each A, B, and C, and then I will print IG. What I want to do here is I want to break the entire loop as soon as I reach the letter B. So I just use the if j equal B, then break. If I run this, I would have assumed that it would have broke the entire thing, right? But what it did is it looped through the I value, A, B, and then broke the second loop. So we never printed C. That's not what I wanted. I want the entire loop to break. If you want to do this, we don't break using the break statement. What we would do instead is we would use a function to say for define breakout, and we can put this entire thing inside the function. And instead of using the break statement, I would have used the return statement. I won't dive too much into what this is, but using the return statement will immediately exist the function. So it will stop the function as soon as you return the statement. So in this case, if you want to loop multiple loops, break multiple loops, you just enclose it into a function. And if you run this, then you have the correct behavior where the entire loop broke when you reach the letter B. Finally, I want to teach you one thing is that for loops can become very, very big because you start using for loop and then you end up with stuff like for I in and then for j in and then for L in and then for blah, blah, blah. This can become very complex to read in code. So it is good to know how you can avoid for loops when you can. There are three main ways that you can avoid for loops. Is one, you can use list comprehensions. The other, you can use some functions plus the lambda function. So for example, if I have this for loop, it will print each value. It will print a list where it appended the values in range 10. If you want to convert this into a list comprehension instead, what you would do here is you would say, okay, you use the square brackets, I for I in range 10. And in this case, you can print ls2 and just say print ls2. And this list comprehension does the same thing as what this loop does. The second technique that you can use to avoid a for loop is to use the map function along with the lambda. So if I'm taking that list, what I'm doing here is I'm taking a list from range 10, but I'm doubling each element and append it to a list. So I end up with 0, 2, 4, 6, 8 with even numbers. Instead of doing this, you could have said, okay, list2 equal and you use the map method. And in the map method, you first need to provide a function and then what is the iterator you use on. So in this case, you use range 10, uh, similar to what we've done it here. And here in the function, we replace this by lambda x times 2. And if you print that second list again, you will see that you end up with a map object. So instead of printing this, what you want to do is return the list element of all that. And you can see that we have the same result without using a for loop this time. The last way to avoid for loops that I want to introduce is using the filter method again with the lambda function. So here, what I have is a list, and I would just want append the even numbers. So here I have in range 10, and I use the modulus operator, and when the modulus is equal 0, then I append I, and the result is the fact that I'm just appending even number here. If I want to do the same thing without a for loop this time, I would use the filter method, the filter function, sorry. And the filter function works similarly to the map function. What you want to give is one function here, and you want to put your iterator here on second argument. And what we'll do is we'll replace the function by lambda x x modulus 2 equals 0. So essentially we're doing the same thing as what we were doing with the if, and we're applying the filter, and if we print even 2, then we will show again an object instead, so we have to put it as a list instead. And doing this, we end up with the same result. Thank you very much. Help me and subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for my upcoming Python for SEO course, which I will link in the description below. You can follow me on any of these platforms. Thank you very much. See you next time.